now we would like to invite Ms. Helen Gilman, Senior Knowledge Management Specialist in the Global Engagement, Knowledge and Strategy Division at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, to give her talk titled Challenges in Measuring Knowledge Management Results and Impact, IFAD's Experience. Ms. Helen, please take the floor.
The topic of my presentation today, as was just said, is Challenges in Measuring Knowledge Management Results and Impact, IFAD's Experience. IFAD is my organisation. I'm going to take a quite broad approach to discussing this topic because I believe that it's relevant to understand something about my organisation, our KM trajectory, what we've learned along the way, and how this influences our thinking on measurement of KM results and impact. After giving a brief overview of what, sorry, I should go on to the next, yes, of what IFAD does and why knowledge is so crucial to our work, and I will talk about the role of KM in IFAD and how it's being mainstreamed into our way of working. In order to illustrate this, I'll discuss a 3-year action learning initiative with, on KM with IFAD-funded projects in Eastern and Southern Africa, from which we've drawn some really in-depth lessons on how to improve large development programs through a systemic learning approach. This is the subject of a paper that's just been published this month in the peer-reviewed Knowledge Management for Development journal, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-author Jürgen Hagmann, the team leader of PICO team, on that. Finally, I'll discuss some of the challenges inherent in monitoring performance and impact of KM, how we're trying to address them in IFAD, and why it is so important to be able to demonstrate KM impacts despite the difficulties. So, just very briefly, what is IFAD? IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It's a specialised UN agency, an international financial institution that provides financing in the form of highly concessional loans to developing country governments for rural development projects. Fundamentally, we focus on improving the food security and nutrition of poor rural people, increasing their incomes and their resilience. Knowledge is crucial to our work. We draw lessons from experience in project implementation, from our partners, from our global policy engagement, including our interactions in major global policy fora. We draw evidence-based knowledge from impact assessments and research. Our goal to scale up successes for expanded and sustainable impact depends on our capacity to be innovative, to learn from experience, and to share and apply that learning. IFAD has a solid history of knowledge management initiatives and an understanding that knowledge from development practice, our own and others, is crucial to achieving our goals. Experience-based knowledge is a comparative advantage for us. It's embedded in our operations, our policies, strategies, workflow, and in the competencies of our staff and partners fundamentally. Our strategic framework puts knowledge at the heart of our work, identifying knowledge building, dissemination, and policy engagement as one of the 4 key pillars of our results delivery. It states a clear purpose for knowledge management, which is very important in any organisation. It must support our efforts to identify, develop, and promote successful and innovative approaches and interventions that have demonstrated potential to be scaled up. We've made notable progress in recent years in improving our capacity for knowledge generation and management. And in fact, this year, aspects of our KM work were recognised as good practice in the UN Joint Inspection Unit's study on UN in the UN KM in the UN system. The report cites our KM strategy, 2007 KM strategy, as one of the most comprehensive and sustainable approaches to KM in the UN system. It also notes that the indicators in our existing KM results framework, which was developed in 2014 and we're now updating, represented the most advanced use of KM indicators across the system. I'd just like to mention a few points on why, why our KM strategy was good practice. Because good strategic guidance from the beginning will eventually help you to be able to figure out the right indicators that you need in order to be able to measure performance. The strategy was developed based on a needs assessment, and it included an inventory of existing knowledge assets so people in the organisation could recognise them. It was linked to IFAD's overall objectives. It was broad and flexible, and provided the space to experiment and learn that people needed in order to be able to actually implement the strategy. One example of this sort of this flexibility and enabling initiatives to emerge was the Action Learning Initiative in Eastern and Southern Africa that I'll speak about in a moment. In effect, the flexible nature of the strategy led to what I call a 1,000 flowers bloom approach, which meant there was a lot of diversity in what we did, which was not necessarily a bad thing. The flexibility meant people didn't feel pressured. They tried things out, learned from experience and adapted. It helped to establish very solid foundations for KM in IFAD, although there were still many challenges. One particular related to that 1,000 flowers bloom approach. Successes were often driven by committed individuals, and so were not always linked into an overall coherent institutional approach, which could make them fragile if circumstances or priorities changed. To remedy this, in 2014 we introduced a KM framework and an action plan in 2016 to give KM a more coherent corporate structure with clear outputs and outcomes. As I will outline a little bit later in this presentation, both form a very solid basis for the more integrated approach we're now developing to monitoring KM performance and impact. I'd now like to talk just briefly about some of the lessons we learned from the KM Action Learning Initiative with IFAD-funded rural development projects in Eastern and Southern Africa. The initiative ran from 2009 to 2012, and was prompted by the need to improve IFAD's capacity to learn from project implementation. We had a broad and ambitious agenda. The starting hypothesis was that projects could only be vehicles for learning, which is how we were describing them at the time, when they embraced an adaptive management approach founded on continuous learning for improved performance. Our approach was a dynamic, adaptive process of action research on the operational systems of projects, combining face-to-face interaction with concrete action in daily practice. As I mentioned earlier, we worked with PICO team and used their systemic competence development approach, whereby participants acquired the skills, understanding and attitudes required to improve their own performance. Over 3 years, we worked with more than 125 project staff from 32 projects in the region in 12 countries. Apart from a number of significant lessons of general relevance, and I'll mention a few in a moment, one of the main outputs of the process was a model for an integrated KM system. You can't really see it very well, but it doesn't matter. The main thing to understand is that the model grew out of the concrete experiences and understanding of KM by project staff, of the relevance in their day-to-day work in project implementation. It has 5 interconnected functions: information management, monitoring and evaluation, communication, and experimentation and innovation, which together support learning and adaptation, rapid learning and adaptation, which in effect is the project management approach. The systems driver is motivation to change and improve. There was also another output, basically a practical guide to putting KM into action. If there are any KM practitioners in the room, they will recognise many of the elements, if they could read it, but I won't go into that. I'm happy to share a link to these models and frameworks if anyone is interested. So, some of the key lessons that we drew from the initiative were KM needs a clear purpose, aligned to organised strategies and goals. I think my colleague here at the front, it was something about this was underpinning your question. KM often becomes an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And from a monitoring point of view, that can leave it open to questions about impact and make it very dispensable when resources are scarce. Therefore, KM for what has to be the central question. One purpose can be KM as part and parcel of a process to improve performance, delivery and impact. Another can be KM as a means to improve visibility and positioning. The need for compelling motivation and incentives is another key lesson. We found that people often had little motivation to change, but a team approach was a major motivating factor. It provided peer-to-peer motivation, encouragement and joint thinking that generated positive energy for improving performance through KM. But overall, in our experience, the strongest motivating factor was that individuals saw the opportunity to improve their practice and ultimately their own careers. Obviously, leadership is absolutely crucial. If managers are convinced that knowledge management is going to help to improve performance and to manage for impact, people will figure out how to integrate it into their daily work. In addition to that, the need to integrate KM into organisational systems, processes and structures and make it a way of working is absolutely fundamental. KM often remains an add-on in organisations and projects because it's difficult to integrate it seamlessly into business processes and management approaches. It has to be recognised as an organisational development process that has performance improvement as its goal. It's a complex intervention in which many elements need to be adapted and revised, and where considerable innovation is required to make it work. Basically, we learned that KM is about good management, teamwork, authentic and honest commitment to impact, allowing common sense to rule, and creating an environment where people are encouraged to reflect, share, and learn from each other. So now on to the final section. I hope I'm within time. I need more than 3. I'll finish and then I won't take any questions. Just a couple more than 3, sorry. The broader environment in which development organisations are operating has changed substantially in the past decade. The aid effectiveness agenda is translated into greater accountability for results, and in turn, this has led for the requirement for concrete impact, and rightly so, measured through hard data, and there's the requirement for better delivery processes. All of this means, or should mean, that knowledge, innovation and competence are increasingly recognised as being fundamental for effective development. It is accepted, at least in the rhetoric, that learning approaches are part of the solution. KM has become, challenges? Right. KM has become mainstream in many organisations, but critical voices continue to challenge its utility versus the cost. Unless it has a clear purpose and is fully integrated into business processes and its effectiveness can be measured, it will sooner or later fall prey to budget cuts and other priorities. Measurement of performance and impact is a challenge for any KM initiative, and I think that's come out in several discussions that we've had, largely because most knowledge is tacit in nature. It's in people's heads. A person's expertise and experience and accumulated specialist knowledge can be difficult to codify. KM is also a distributed activity throughout an organisation. Some KM activities are obvious and easy to measure, such as the number of knowledge products or the number of downloads. Others are more subtle and often defy measurement. For example, how to measure the influence or impact of knowledge activities on policymakers, or demonstrate the improved skills of employees, or measure the links between KM activities and improved effectiveness, efficiency and value for money. And I think we'll be going into that in more depth tomorrow. Additionally, in order to measure KM impact and performance in a meaningful way, there must first be a common understanding of what KM means for an organisation and why it is important. Without this, it will be difficult to establish agreed indicators. There needs to be agreement on what it is important to measure, what do we want to know, and why. Okay, 2 long minutes? Okay, I'll go very quickly. Where are we? Yeah, I'll just quickly mention that there has been a study on evidence from evaluations of KM in international financial institutions that interestingly showed that all the organisations reviewed could provide evidence of high impact products and services, but all struggled to identify their overall impact, both internally and externally to organisations. In particular, they didn't have indicators that would enable them to establish whether knowledge strategies have resulted in significant changes, in particular to core business processes. In IFAD right now, I'm leading an initiative to develop a methodology for monitoring and reporting on KM. We're going to fundamentally build on what already exists, try to make what already exists more KM sensitive, and only introduce new indicators if they really are important and meaningful in order to enable us to measure outcomes, not only outputs. And I think this is a really fundamental lesson for any organisation, because people, in our organisation, the pressure to deliver and to produce hard evidence of impact can at times crowd out learning and the imperative to learn. So anything that may measure the impact of knowledge management and learning in my organisation is likely to be seen as some sort of irrelevant add-on. Some of the other softer factors, just very briefly, as I said before, people need to understand what KM means in their daily work. What are the benefits? We need capacity and resources. That also implies that time invested by people in these activities needs to be recognised. That is an important incentive. Just very briefly before I finish, we actually did a quick review of KM experiences, strategies and monitoring frameworks in other organisations, UN, IFIs and private sector, that produced some really interesting lessons. As I said, corporate indicators need to be KM sensitive. You need to know what to measure. No particular indicator is more effective than any other. Indicators are contextual to organisations. Depends on your priorities, in fact, your political priorities. And just to conclude, in practical terms, I suppose we need to acknowledge that the results of good knowledge management, which is going to help us figure out what to measure, should encompass evidence-based support to decision-making, targeted knowledge sharing to improve results, increased efficiency through reusing ideas and applying lessons and easily accessing documents when similar situations arise, always a challenge, learning from mistakes by analysing and sharing lessons and experience, creating new knowledge through collaboration, and stimulating innovative products and services. I hope that, in conclusion, I hope this presentation has been useful, and that by using the example of my organisation and our lessons, I've been able to say something that is relevant to all of you. I think that, mainstreaming KM into an organisation's way of working can happen without an organisation having in place a comprehensive system for monitoring performance. It's happened in my organisation. But as I've tried to point out a number of times, and I think this is probably my key message, unless the concrete impact of KM can be demonstrated, it will always remain vulnerable to changing circumstances, shifting priorities and budget cuts. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, please join me in thanking Dr. Helen. Clearly, the issue of knowledge management and all its implications and complications came across in Dr. Helen's paper, and the number of parameters that go into making a knowledge management system useful. Clearly, you've identified many issues, and I think there was a lot in that paper to digest. So we will put the, we'll give the chance to the floor for any questions. Yes, Professor Amr.
70% of the people in the developing countries, they live in that area of agriculture. So any kind of knowledge will definitely help these people at least to improve their well-being and increase. But the question that I wanted to ask, I think about 40 or 50 years ago, they invested lots of money in what they called the Green Revolution. And that had an impact, and we still read stories about what happened in the Philippines and Mexico in terms of at least helping in inventing of new kind of technologies that really help many of these countries. Now, trying to implement again this kind of knowledge management in the developing countries. And I'm also thinking, going back to the question that we asked, that it is a sophisticated system, requires some kind of skills and technology. It needs basically some kind of literacy about, and we are talking here about digital technologies. So in order to implement these kind of project and program, again, you need an infrastructure, you need some kind of form of education. There are many examples, of course, Muhammad Yunus of Bangladesh, he used these kind of technologies, and I think that's also a part of this knowledge management. So the question that, I mean, this effort and this kind of, let's say, work that you are doing, how it is going to help and how it is different than, let's say, the research that was done in particular by many universities in the United States and other, in terms of helping the rural population in this area of food, water management, energy, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. I was worried that you were going to ask a question because you always ask very difficult and challenging ones. So I think that the answer to your question could be the subject of another conference, actually, because it's very broad. But what I will say is I understand your question. I can answer it in a couple of, I'll try to answer it in a couple of fairly straightforward ways. With specific reference to what I discussed here, with the work I do at the corporate level in IFAD and the work I did with the projects in Eastern and Southern Africa, it's all very much focused on how to use knowledge management and learning to improve the organisation or the project's capacity to deliver better results and impact. So it's about better capacity to generate, manage, use, as in apply, or share knowledge. So that's sort of specifically what this was about. It's more of an institutional context, but when you go out of that institutional context, it's about improving our capacity to make a difference, to deliver. So in IFAD, for example, because we focus on agriculture and rural development, we need to have really pretty rigorous systems in place that enable us to learn from project implementation, to apply those lessons, ideally continuously, to improve during implementation of a project, and then to use those lessons, to draw on those lessons to design better interventions. That's the scaling up aspect, learning during implementation to inform the design of new projects. That's also very institutional. I think, so that's sort of about this context. I mean, your broader question, when you referred back to the Green Revolution, you can't, just very simply put, I don't believe that you can scale up either horizontally or vertically, geographically, or at policy level, successful in development interventions unless you have really been able to seriously learn, understand what were the factors to contributing to the success or failure of that intervention, that learning may be documented, but more fundamentally it needs to influence policy and practice. Just documenting it is not going to necessarily mean that it influences policy and practice. I think IFAD struggles with this, but we really are doing a lot of work, not only at the global level on policy engagement, but at the national level, to ensure that what is learned from project implementation actually feeds into government policies, processes, and practice, which I think is, I mean, the answer could be very long, but I think it partly addresses your question. The third element of that, just very briefly, is that I wanted to mention that, and I didn't get time, there is what is called an agenda knowledge for development that has been developed in a parallel process. It's not a multilateral process as it was with the SDGs. It's a parallel process that is attempting to address the knowledge dimensions of development, the knowledge-related dimensions of development. So it's a complement to Agenda 2030. And I think it actually probably encompasses a lot of what you were asking me in your question and what you were asking Petru before. There are some copies out there. I'll make sure that I can give you a copy. It's a really, really interesting initiative, and it's now being driven by a new international NGO called the Knowledge for Development Partnership, which is just emerging now. It was actually launched at a big UN conference in Geneva in March, organised by Petru. So I'm happy, if anybody is interested to know more about that, I'm happy to give you some background. I hope in a muddled way that has somehow answered your question.
There's room for one last question, please. Make the questions very brief, because I think we are running out of time drastically. Please, Dr. Milham.
Thank you, Helen, for your excellent presentation. I think organizations like yours, like the UN, like universities, face that challenge that the products produced through knowledge management are used at the corporate level, but the end beneficiaries are in the field and they're poor, and many of them don't read and write nor speak English. We all have this challenge. So just a few comments of what seems to work for the World Bank. We are doing more and more citizen feedback. So the laborers using, let's say, videos on how to plant bananas or tomatoes or whatever, making agriculture more resilient, are providing feedback. And second, you pointed it, use of local NGOs, train the trainer, etc., seems to work for us. But it's a huge challenge, and we totally resonate with what you mentioned.
I think very short, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think I would like to put my question from an economist point of view, right? Efficiency and productivity. That is perhaps the major goal for all those KM process or something like that. But we haven't come across yet one particular issue, which is called waste. Waste, as you can see in the area of food or in the area of even big projects or something like that. Huge wastes are taking place. You mentioned about a couple of projects in Africa. I was wondering whether this waste variable can be put into in your model, you see, so that at least minimize a bit of cost and also increase the efficiency and productivity. Thank you.
Yeah, very short. I think Petru also mentioned this before. When you talk about waste in this context, I'm thinking about reinventing the wheel. I'm thinking about not learning, not being aware that what you are trying to figure out is already being figured out. It's like if I don't know it, it doesn't exist. You know, it's this is really, really a big challenge in development. You know, I'm just thinking about Nepal. How many decades? How many billions of dollars? What's happened? You know, it's like I don't know if I should really say it, but I've worked in development for 25 years, and I find it really shocking how often we repeat the same mistakes.
I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Jamil bin Mohammed Al Hameidan, representative of His Royal Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Salman Al-Khalifa, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Bahrain, Professor Abdullah Al-Hawaj, Professor Mansour Al-Ali, and Professor Alam Ahmed to please come on stage to present tokens of appreciation to our keynote speaker. Ms. Helen Gilman,